on Wednesday night. And thank you for joining LBC 97.3. Your late night London is underway. We've been discussing the bedroom tax, criticism of it by the UN official, and Grant Shapps' response. He's really been caught, I think. He's been caught out. That's why he's so frustrated and angry that somebody from outside of the UK would come in and be so critical about a government policy. Anyway, let's continue that conversation. I also want to turn our attention to the fact that Downing Street has insisted the government is to go ahead with the Chancellor's flagship Help to Buy scheme, despite a warning by the Business Secretary, Vince Cable, that it could lead to a new housing market bubble. Yes, old Vince has called for an urgent rethink for plans to provide government subsidies and guarantees for low deposit mortgages from next January. Amid signs, a serious housing inflationary pressure was already developing. Now, I personally think we should run everything by Vince. I've come to the opinion that whatever policy is announced, Vince always a few months later tends to go, I always thought that was a terrible idea. He did predict the crash of late 2007, 2008. He was the only politician in the House who was warning people, warning MPs, warning the government, of course, when he was in opposition as a Lib Dem deputy leader. And did anybody listen? No. So now he's the business secretary. I find it remarkable that he wasn't in on this policy in the first place. He said we should certainly think about how it should come into effect, Help to Buy, indeed, whether it should come into effect at all in the light of changing market conditions. We don't want a new housing bubble. Well, we've all been predicting this housing bubble. That's what we're heading towards. False inflation of property stock is due to the demand, I would guess. And it doesn't help those who are forced to move out of their homes because they're losing £18 a week in housing benefit. All this is connected, and all of this is something that the government should really have their heads around. So why is it now, after George has announced this fabulous policy, Help to Buy, let's really get everyone buying their own home, for the business secretary, a man who's very experienced? I mean, let's not forget, George Osborne's never had a job outside of the Tory party. Vince, of course, wasn't he finance director for a big, was it oil company? Shell or one of those, I seem to remember. I mean, at least he's got a little experience. So who would you rather listen to? And what is the solution to Britain's housing crisis? 0845 6060 973. Andrew Treacher is the property expert and director of Blackstock and an independent consultancy, and joins us on the line. Hello, Andrew.
Good evening.
Evening, sir. So we're in a bit of a situation here with this Help to Buy scheme. It was hailed as the new dawn for getting on the ladder. Has Vince got a point? Could it actually cause a problem for the housing market, a new bubble?
Potentially, yes. I mean, what you've got is something. I mean, the sort of term we have in it in the industry is help to buy. It's help to buy votes. It's a typical political, with a big P, a political statement designed to create some headlines and pave the way, hopefully, for where the Tories are concerned, for an electoral victory. But in reality, what it's doing, when you look at the figures, most of the housing industry in the UK is camped out down in Wales for a big conference called Resi over the next couple of days. We're actually going to have the housing minister here tomorrow talking about this. But there's some data that Savills, the estate agent, are publishing tomorrow, and what that shows basically is what Help to Buy is going to be doing is simply shifting forward house price growth. So the house price growth we get over the next 5 years, rather than kind of being spread over those years, is simply going to happen over the next couple of years. And that's basically what the government's banking on. They're banking on the fact that over the next couple of years we'll see some nice positive movement, and people will think, oh, fantastic, haven't the government done well, we'll vote them back in, and everything will be happy and jolly forever after.
But Andrew, this is criminal. What you're describing is nothing short of criminal. This is fraud on a massive scale.
Well, it's politics, isn't it? I mean,
come on, we mustn't split hairs here, must we? Because, if the rest of us, out on Civvy Street were to manipulate the market in such a way so that people will end up either in negative equity or in a situation where they can't afford their mortgages, then that would be called fraud and we'd be put in prison.
Well, I mean, I think you need to be clear that this isn't going to manipulate anything. It's simply creating demand. And the problem, that what the government is hoping for here, is that by unlocking the mortgage market and making it more possible for transactions to take place, that house builders will build more homes. And the problem you have is that it doesn't necessarily make economical sense for the big listed house builders to simply double their production, because it's not like, a Chinese garment factory that makes twice the profits if it doubles its production, because there's a whole manner of complexities around house building through the supply of land and all the other complexities. I won't bore people at 10:30 at night, that mean that Barclays, Crest Nicholson, Taylor Wimpey, etc. aren't simply going to wake up tomorrow morning and go, right, we're going to double our production, because they're not, and they haven't. And that's what we're seeing. So the fundamental issue you have with the housing market in this country, and specifically in London, is the lack of new homes. And what the data that Savills is publishing tomorrow is going to say is that over the next few years, you're looking at around 25% house price growth across London and the southeast, which is, it's phenomenal.
But it's terrible, isn't it? I mean, that's really it's the work of the devil to see house prices rise that much.
Well,
we shouldn't be celebrating it, should we?
But what's good for some people is bad for others. If you're a young couple that's just bought a house recently in, I don't know, in Barking or in Islington, then that's good for you. If it's someone that's trying to get on a housing ladder, then you're right. It's obviously a negative thing. So that's the thing, is that something that's negative for one person is fantastic for somebody else. There'll be some people that will be quite happy to see this kind of house price inflation, other people less so. I think the other conversation we need to have in this country is whether housing ownership at all costs is the thing that everyone should aspire to. Why do we not look at the rental market, which is a very big and successful investment market in the States, across Europe, and in America, you have many pension funds that build large-scale portfolios of homes to rent, and it's something that is starting to creep into the UK. It's something that many large businesses, large pension funds and institutions are looking at in London. And that's one of the things that I think that isn't politically palatable at the minute, that needs to be really considered, is this obsession we have with ownership. And that's one of the things that, as you say, drives people into negative equity, it drives people into huge debt, and actually could be alleviated by just actually considering that housing should be provided perhaps as a service, same as renting a car, same as buying shopping, same as renting a hotel. Actually, housing should be a service. Some people could argue, and if you want to invest money, you invest money in a separate forum.
What about the rental market? Because, of course, as you quite rightly say, people are moving not necessarily through choice. They're being pushed towards rental because to get a deposit together, you need at least £60,000 in cash to put down on many of these schemes, unless, of course, you get involved in a shared ownership scheme or something similar to that. So people are going to the renting sector, but we're finding that landlords, because they base the market forces, they claim they've got some equation they do based upon the sales market to achieve their rental price. That is only going to mean that rents will continue to rise, and people again will be struggling to meet those costs.
Yeah, I mean, it comes fundamentally down to supply and demand. If you can get a price for something, you will tap it up, and that's the same. It's the same in any market. I mean, it's the same whether you're talking about renting a house. It's the same whether you're talking about buying a vintage guitar. If there is a demand for a product or a service, then people will pay that. And it comes down to the supply. It fundamentally comes down to the supply. And the problem is in London is there isn't the supply of homes. I mean, in the rental market alone, between 2014 and 2016, you're looking at over 600,000 rented households being created. That's 600,000 new households. That could be one or two people moving into the rented sector in London, the private rented sector. That's not social housing, that's normal market rented homes. And that basically, it's an astonishing sum that shows you just how much capacity there is for new housing. The government has stated many times that it isn't about to go back into building homes. It doesn't want to borrow money to build social housing. But actually, if you look at the figures and you look at the amount that housing value will go up over the next few years, there is a huge argument that says, right, if we're spunking £60 billion on high-speed 2 rail that nobody wants, why don't they just spend some of that money building houses?
Yeah.
And there's a very firm argument that says, right, if you do that, you've got the rental income from social housing, because that all gets basically charged back to the Department for Work and Pensions. You've got the capital value that could potentially go up over 20, 30 years. So, if the government borrows a bunch of money now, whilst it's really cheap, it could invest that in housing, have a many, many, many millions of pounds worth of assets it could get rental income from and drive value out of the long term.
But ultimately it brings the value down of those very expensive properties, and that is how the rich are getting richer. They're suddenly seeing their portfolios increase in value, and if you start building down the bottom end of the market, it's only going to bring those down at the top end, I would have thought. I mean, my biggest worry, though, Andrew, is for somebody who wants to pay their way, somebody who can only get a minimum wage job, because there is, if you go in the job centre these days, most of the jobs advertised are £6.19 an hour. So if you work 50 hours a week, that's £309. You've got to pay tax on that. If you've got a family to look after or feed or whatever, I mean, what are you going to be left over with? I mean, you're not going to be able to rent a place in London or even close to London on £309 or £350 a week, are you? So
no, that's correct.
This is the situation that we're in, isn't it?
It is. I mean, the solution to that, it's a bit more complex than just building homes. I mean, I think the clear solution to that is that people on that kind of salary should not be encouraged to get into huge piles of debt that a mortgage gives you. Because ultimately, if you are on a low income, encouraging people to take on hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of debt just seems ridiculous.
But it's not even in their ballpark. I mean, in fact, these people will be sleeping in a ballpark, Andrew.
Well, no, quite possibly. I mean, but I think one of the solutions to that is further reform of the planning system, and there are other routes into the planning system, because I think the problem in this country is that we look at things in such a black and white way, and that's partly the media's fault, it's partly the political system's fault, but we look at things either social housing at one end or one Hyde Park at the other, posh homes for rich Russians. But and you're right that there are many people that kind of fall in between that, people that earn money, that perhaps earn a bit too much for social housing, that can't quite afford to buy a house, that possibly can't afford to rent a house at the market rent, that possibly something in between, and there are key worker housing or intermediate housing is the kind of jargon phrase that the industry gives it, and this stuff can be provided by people, but it needs the planning system, it needs councils to recognise it properly, because from a development point of view, basically, I mean, as I sort of mentioned, the government has stated that it's not going to build homes, so that means you have to ask, well, who's going to build them? So it's the development industry, the private sector, and they're only going to do this stuff if it's profitable, because they're not charities, they're owned by shareholders, pension funds, whoever else. The private sector isn't going to build properties that it can't make a profit on. So the challenge for the political sector, for the planning system, is to enable that to happen. And if we can create the right planning use classes that enable developers to go, right, we'll build homes for this lot of people that perhaps are on low income, and they might be smaller properties, for example, because actually, in this day and age, do you have to have a big garden?
Even a small prefabricated home. I mean, I speak to people all the time on this programme who would love to have a cheap, affordable prefabricated home that had a 60-year guarantee, for example, and could be put up in 2 weeks and could be plugged in, all modular, and would be the latest thing, and they wouldn't need much to spend much to heat it. But the councils won't do that. They're not into it.
But the councils need to. And this is the problem. If you've got minimum space standards that are ridiculously large and pointlessly big, from the developer's point of view, they look at it and go, right, we can't make money out of that, so we're not going to do it. And ultimately, that's what you need. Because if this country is relying on the private sector to build homes, you need to make it work for the private sector.
So it's a catch-22, really, isn't it? It's a catch-22, and we're going to have this conversation for another decade. We've been having it for a decade already. Meanwhile, there are people having to sleep in bed and breakfasts and at the taxpayers' expense because there is simply nowhere for them to go. Andrew, I've got to go myself, but listen, thank you so much for your expertise tonight. You've been absolutely fascinating, and all the very best to you. Andrew Treacher is the property expert and director of Blackstock, which is an independent consultancy, joining us here on LBC 97.3.